Welcome to today's webinar, Voting in the Era of COVID-19, Your Rights at the Polls and Vote by Mail. If at any point during this presentation you have questions for our speakers, please add them into the question box on your screen. We will address them at the end of our presentation. We will share today's slide deck and all other materials after the webinar. Thank you for joining. We'll be getting started shortly. Welcome to today's webinar, Voting in the Era of COVID-19, Your Rights at the Polls and Vote by Mail. If at any point during the presentation you have questions for our speakers, please add them into the question box on your screen. We will address them at the end of our presentation. We will share today's slide deck and all other materials after the webinar. Thank you for joining. We'll be getting started shortly. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Voting in the Era of COVID-19, Your Rights at the Polls and Vote by Mail. My name is Nancy Flores and I'm with the National Partnership of New Americans, and I will be your moderator for today's presentation. Today's webinar is part of New American Voters 2020 webinar series. New American Voters is a digital civic engagement effort that harnesses the collective power of NPNA's 41 member and affiliate organizations in this critical year to ensure that the voices of all naturalized citizens are heard at the polls. Naturalized citizens are now 1 in 10 eligible voters in the United States. This emerging voting bloc is multicultural, multiracial, majority women, and diverse in age. However, in this critical and historic year, it's not enough to naturalize. In 2020, we must vote. We launched this campaign in mid-June with two purposes. The first is to encourage the millions of newly naturalized citizens to vote this year, and secondly, to build the national narrative that newly naturalized citizens are a force to be reckoned with. They're growing not just in port of entry cities, but also in battleground states, and they should be addressed and listened to. NPNA is proud to partner with our 41 member organizations in 37 states, as well as our partner organizations, which are some of the organizations that you see on your screen. Today's presentation is hosted by the ACLU, Voces de la Frontera, our NPNA member in Wisconsin, and us, NPNA. And we're happy to begin today's presentation. Our first speaker, we'll dive right in. So many of us saw on national news that Wisconsin became a focal point and a clear example of what not to do in an election during the height of a pandemic. Considered a battleground state, where both presidential candidates are close in polling, all eyes will continue to be on Wisconsin, among other key states. We want to open today's conversation by hearing from an organization that ran an electoral campaign for the primary during the height of the pandemic and their lessons learned and suggested best practices as we head into November. Our first speaker is Erika Ramirez, organizer at Voces de la Frontera in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Welcome, Erika.
Thank you, Nancy, and everybody as well. Yeah, so my name is Erika from Wisconsin, from Voces de la Frontera. I'm the civic engagement organizer. So a lot of the work that we've been doing has been since April, with our getting out the vote efforts, helping people with registering to vote, requesting absentee ballots and giving information of elections. And maybe I can just, dive in, and I can start with a little bit of context about how our elections went in April and in August, even though, in these primaries, there was somewhat of a shift and things did improve between both of these primaries, there's still a lot of obstacles that we did have in both of these primaries. So I can start off with the April 7th elections that we had. That was a very dire time. As you can see also in the slide, we only had 5 polling locations that were open in the city of Milwaukee, and many other cities throughout the state of Wisconsin had issues with polling locations being accessible to them for these April 7th elections. Usually Milwaukee has 180 polling locations, and that was down to 5. There was hours-long waits, and with these specific 5 polling locations, there was no type of PPE materials. There were volunteers that were having to go and give masks to people and pens, because polling locations were funded at that time. They didn't have enough resources, and there weren't many poll workers working as well. So that was one of the key obstacles that we had. Another key obstacle from the April 7th election was that elections were being considered to be postponed. At the end, that didn't happen. There was also a change that was done prior to the day prior to the election of having absentee ballots extended and having that deadline up till April 13th, so giving people a bit more time in case they wanted to vote in a safer way, voting from home. That they, again, in the last day prior to the election, they made that change. So many people were not able to either receive their absentee ballot on time. It was very common for us to hear our community members getting their ballots past the election day because they were thinking that they could have still turned it in April 13th, which wasn't the case. Other issues that we have been fighting here in the state of Wisconsin has been our photo ID laws. So people, when they go vote, need to show some proper photo ID. And an issue with that is that usually, our communities of color as well as, our working class folks tend to have more issues with getting this information, especially since many times you do have to pay to get a driver's license and get that information updated in case you changed your address. At the same time, DMVs have not been accessible. Many continue to stay closed, even though there was a memorandum from our Governor Evils to provide more accessibility to people. Recently, there's also been change with some of the requirements when it comes to voting. Before, here in the state of Wisconsin, you only had to live in a residency in the past 10 days to be able to vote. That got changed first to 25 days, now to 28 days. Information is not being disseminated about this, so people are not familiar with this new length of residency requirement, and things have not been given with enough notice. So the 28-day mark for the August 11th elections got changed a week prior to the election, and people didn't know about it. It wasn't being, mentioned in any way from our commissions that have to do with elections. I can, continue talking a lot about what obstacles we had from, our first primary in April to our second one, which was in August. Just real quickly, a lot of people also got purged from the voting rolls, so they needed, in case their information was considered to not be updated, they would just automatically not be considered registered voters, even though they, voted 3 years ago. So a lot of people got affected in that way. And there's been instances as well that polling locations haven't been accessible to people who, have diversities and might not be necessarily able-bodied. So from April to August, one thing that we did see an improvement, that we did have more locations statewide. Many throughout the state of Wisconsin did have all polling locations as they usually do. Milwaukee, being the biggest city, still didn't have all of them. We only had 165 compared to 180. But this also taking in mind a couple things. One is that, early voting locations were given, that we didn't get enough heads up to know this information. At the same time, polling locations were changed. So in my case, for example, my polling location changed 3 times in the last 6 months, so since February to August. and a lot of information wasn't being disseminated completely about that information. And also, since Voces de la Frontera actively works with our communities that are specifically, immigrant, Latinx, statewide, a lot of information in a statewide level, even here in Milwaukee where, ballots can be bilingual, there's not information being disseminated in Spanish. So even if information is being sent out, a lot of our community members are still not, are needing to get more information in their language. So if I can now just move on to, lessons that we have learned, would be this, focusing clearly on bilingual voter education, which is very needed and dire, especially in our communities. That way we can make sure that proper information is being given in their language when it comes to registering to vote, requesting absentee ballots, and having all information necessary when it comes to the elections. And at the same time, really focusing on the importance of requesting absentee ballots. This because we know that polling locations, change, they're not always accessible, and, things can, change from 1 minute to the next. We just want to make sure that then, absentee ballots is the way that we go. And in regards to best practices and things that we are, working on for the general election and our GOTV efforts, as mentioned, we just want to make sure that we connect with our base with more bilingual information. We want to make sure that there's more poll workers that are also bilingual and speak the language of our community. So we're, reaching out to our member base, trying to get them involved and active and engaged, not only as, volunteers within Voces, but also doing their civic duty and being, poll workers, especially if they, are younger and healthier folk. Another thing that we'll be doing is we're going to have a campaign centered on providing witness signatures for absentee ballots and picking up ballots for individuals in case they need so. And this will help people who might have difficulty when it comes to accessibility. We would also make sure that we will be doing, phone banks and, calling people to, once they do get their absentee ballot, if they have requested it, to follow up with these individuals in case they would need any help, or just to remind them that the sooner the better. The sooner that they send their absentee ballot back, the better it would be, and to make sure that it's counted. We'll be also giving information, voter education of where they can, track their ballots in case they hasn't arrived yet, or once they turn it in, they can track it to see that it was submitted and confirm that it was submitted and accepted in the proper way. And lastly, within our community, we have been vastly affected with COVID. We still want to make sure that safety is our biggest concern, and we just want to make sure that we're also providing other alternatives for people to get access to this information, specifically voter registering and requesting their absentee ballots. So we will be doing also some in-person activities and canvassing. One thing that we've focused on is doing it in spaces that are obviously outside, but where people will already be wearing their mask and, be following proper protocols. So outside of grocery stores where, people are a bit more concerned, and spaces as well concerned with, 6 feet distancing and things like that. So that's kind of what, Wisconsin looks like right now. And again, I want to thank you all so much for listening and being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Erika, and all of the team at Voces for your critical work. I know that we'll continue to stay tuned to what's happening in Wisconsin. There's already a couple of questions that have come in for you, so we'll get to those in the Q&A panel. So just a reminder to folks that if you have questions for any of our presenters, please do drop them into the Q&A box. All right, so moving right along. Next, I'd like to welcome Bobby Hoffman, Advocacy and Policy Council, Voting Rights at the ACLU. Welcome, Bobby.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Erica, for all the work that you're doing in Wisconsin to ensure that every eligible voter has a chance to vote in a safe and secure fashion this upcoming election. To start, I'll give a little bit of background on the ACLU. The American Civil Liberties Union was founded in 1920, so this year we are celebrating our 100th year as an organization where we've been fighting for civil rights and civil liberties. These include the right to vote, rights for immigrants, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, the right to free speech, among many more. In my role at the ACLU, I'm very fortunate. I get to focus on voting rights issues. I've been at the ACLU for 3.5 years now, and as part of my role, I'm fortunate that I get to work with all of our affiliates. We have affiliates in all 50 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. So as part of my role, I get to work with them on voting rights issues as they occur in their state legislatures, and also work with them as voting rights issues kind of come through Congress. As some general background before we kind of jump into voting rights laws on the ground, election administration in the United States is highly decentralized. So no state administers elections in the same way. There are some broad restrictions that are put in place by Congress. For example, no state can have a voter registration deadline that is later than 30 days out from election day. However, there's a lot of leniency there where some states set it at 30 days, and many states allow individuals to register to vote even on election day. So there is a great deal of variety as you go from one state to the next. In terms of how elections are administered throughout the United States, which kind of leads us into the different types of ways in which one can cast their ballot this upcoming election. There's really 3 different types of ways. You can cast your ballot by mail or absentee. You can cast your ballot in person before Election Day through either early voting or what is sometimes referred to as absentee in-person voting. And then lastly, all individuals will have an opportunity to cast a ballot in person on Election Day. We can start with voting by mail or absentee voting. There are essentially 4 different categories of absentee voting for this upcoming election in November. The first is universal distribution of ballots by mail. That is notated on the map by states that are green. What's going to occur in these states for November's election is that every single registered voter is going to be mailed their ballot before Election Day. Once those voters receive their ballots, though, they'll have options of how they want to return it. Many voters will return their ballot by mail. However, they will also have the option in many of these places to drop off their ballot at local drop boxes or take their ballot to a local election administrator's office, or possibly return it to a polling location on Election Day. This is really, those states in green are really the gold standard for how to administer an election during COVID, because what they are, essentially doing by sending out ballots to every single registered voter is making sure that, as local election administrators are dealing with the issues on Election Day that Erica had just talked about, that many, many more people will have voted before Election Day. And, as election administrators are dealing with the fallout of, poll workers not being able to show up, that, many people trying to figure out where their polling location is, that, a large majority of folks will have already cast a ballot in those states, which is fantastic. So it's 10 states in DC. These are mostly Western states. In Washington and Oregon, they've been doing voting by this method for some time now. Oregon started the process 20 years ago. In the 2000 election, they conducted a nearly all-mail election. And in a year that was plagued with election administration issues, I'm sure many remember Florida, Oregon was able to seamlessly conduct an election primarily through the mail. And, their voters consider this a safe, secure, and trusted form of, casting their ballot. And I think as as we see elections conducted for the first time in many other states like this, so for example, Vermont and New Jersey, it will be interesting to see how many of those voters would like to keep that as an opportunity in future election cycles and will enjoy the process of voting by mail. Moving on to the next category, like looking at the light blue states, these are 25 states where individuals are able to cast a ballot through no excuse absentee voting or voting by mail without providing an excuse. So for these individuals, there's still one extra step involved in compared to the green states. Individuals in these states will have to request an absentee ballot. In many of these states, they're going to, election administrators will take a proactive step and mail individuals a form that they can fill out and return it at what's known as an absentee ballot request form. Or in many of these states, in addition to the absentee ballot request form, many individuals will have an opportunity to fill out a form online and request an absentee ballot that way. Additionally, in some states, individuals can even call up their local election administrator and request an absentee ballot over the phone. Some examples in these states, my favorite of these is Arizona because it's somewhat in between the green states and the blue states. In Arizona, individuals have to request an absentee ballot, but as part of that process, they can also request to be able to permanently receive an absentee ballot. This is called their permanent early voting list. And people in Arizona really, really enjoy that option. So nearly 80% of people in the 2018 election cast a ballot by mail because, the first time that they had signed up, they said, please send it to me for all future elections. And that really takes a lot of the administration off of the local election administrators and really frees it up so that folks know that, for all future elections that they're going to receive the ballot by the mail. And if they would like, they can call and cancel it or, request to go vote in person instead in future elections. Another example from this list is Florida. In Florida, voting by mail is also very popular. In the 2018 election, 31% of voters cast a ballot by mail before election day in Florida. So it is a very, very popular method in those two states where many voters request a ballot and then send it in before election day. The third grouping of states is rather interesting in these purple states. These are states that have traditionally required an excuse for individuals to request and cast an absentee ballot. However, due to COVID, they have allowed any individual who has a concern over contracting COVID-19 to list that as a reason when they are requesting an absentee ballot. So while an excuse is still required, COVID-19 is now a valid excuse. So in these places, we're expecting to see requests of absentee ballots really grow over the next 60 days before election day. So we're going to see in New York, a state that has traditionally had very low numbers of voters cast their ballot by mail. I believe in 2018 it was only 4%. We may see numbers of 10 to 20 times higher than that for the 2020 election because COVID-19 is now a valid excuse in order to request and cast an absentee ballot. And then the last grouping of states, the states in red, are really the most concerning. In these states, an excuse is still required in order to cast an absentee ballot. Fortunately, in many of these places, we still have ongoing litigation. Additionally, in South Carolina, for example, the state legislature is coming back into session this week and may address that issue. So we may see South Carolina, along with maybe a few of these other states, move from red to purple, which would be, a tremendous win for voting rights in those states. Moving on from mail and absentee voting, I'll talk a little bit about the option to vote early in person. So for this map, you'll see that all but 8 states provide some form of early voting or absentee in-person voting. For states that provide absentee in person, in general, the same rules that apply for casting a ballot by absentee, if an excuse is required. When casting an absentee ballot, that excuse is still required when casting an absentee ballot in person. However, due to COVID, many of those restrictions have been loosened, as we saw in kind of those purple states in the last slide. So, you know, in tying these two slides together, in 2016 and 2018, nearly half of the electorate cast a ballot either by mail or absentee voting or by in-person voting before Election Day. So even before Election Day, nearly half of all ballots cast in the 2016 and 2018 elections were already done so by the electorate. So these are not necessarily new forms of voting for many individuals. However, we're going to see those numbers increase quite a bit this cycle because in order to stay safe during COVID, and you know, in many cases, as people are concerned about avoiding long lines or you know, adhering to social distancing guidelines, many folks are going to be much more interested in casting an absentee ballot or casting their ballot before Election Day during early vote this upcoming election in November. Next, I'll give a little bit of information on the rights of voters on Election Day. So a few kind of popular things to know is that in regard to your rights on Election Day, first is, especially if we're seeing long lines on Election Day, this will be really important. If the polls close while individuals are still in line, they are still eligible and have the right to vote, but they must stay in line. So this is something that I live in Virginia. We oftentimes have long lines throughout parts of Virginia. As the polls close, we really focus on ensuring that folks stay in line and have their vote counted, because even though the polls have technically closed, they are not closed until every single person who was in line at the time the polls closed have an opportunity to cast their ballot. Second is that if you make a mistake on your ballot while voting, you can certainly request a new one. Thirdly, if machines are down at your polling location, you can ask for a paper ballot. And then lastly, we'll have some information on this on my last slide. However, if you run into any problems or have any questions on Election Day or before Election Day, please call the Election Protection Hotline. It's 866-OUR-VOTE. And then I'll have some additional information on the last slide for additional languages that are provided by the Election Protection Hotline. Next, I'll turn to our nationwide litigation. So for the latest updates, we're going to have that available on aclu.org/voter. But we currently, through ACLU's Voting Rights Project, we currently have 20 different lawsuits that are relevant to voting rights that are impacted by COVID. Two of the more likely scenarios that come up for our litigation is, first, we've been challenging excuse requirements. So if you think back to those red states on the first slide that are still requiring individuals provide an excuse and are not allowing for COVID to be an excuse to cast an absentee ballot, we've been challenging those states in court, you know, seeking out as a remedy that they allow all individuals who are concerned about COVID-19 to be able to request and cast a ballot by mail or through absentee voting. One of the other issues, the second most common issue that we've been litigating over is challenging overly burdensome witness and notary requirements for absentee voting. So one example of success here in Virginia is that the state, the Commonwealth here requires individuals provide a witness signature as part of turning in their absentee ballot. However, due to litigation, we were able to secure a victory, and even if individuals do not provide a witness signature, their ballot will still be counted. Obviously, in the age of COVID, if individuals are living alone and are concerned about social distancing and staying healthy, seeking out a neighbor or a friend to, come into close contact with you while you fill out your ballot and observe you filling out your ballot is often, would be very problematic for social distancing guidelines. So we've had some successes there. We're also currently challenging a law in North Carolina that also requires a witness signature. Fortunately, their legislature recently moved from requiring 2 signatures to 1, but we're still seeking out to have them lower it even further to no signatures. Next, I'll turn to some best practices and considerations to ensure that your vote is counted. First, I'll start with is voting by mail. If you're voting by mail, please request your ballot now. Request it as soon as possible. For example, I've recently moved to Virginia, and as part of being registered here, one of the first things I did was request an absentee ballot. I was able to do so online. By requesting ballots now, it will have a benefit to you because you'll be receiving your ballot sooner, but it'll also have a benefit down the line because we want to ensure that there's not a bottleneck, and we don't want everyone making an absentee ballot request closer to Election Day, because those absentee ballot request forms need to be processed by election administrators, and it does take some time for them to do so. So this will help flatten the curve of absentee ballot requests as they come into state election administrators. Secondly, once you do receive your ballot, fill it in and return it as soon as possible. And please double check and make sure you filled out everything correctly. There are, and oftentimes in every election, there is a percentage of ballots that are rejected or, unable to be counted because key information was left off of the absentee ballot envelope or the vote by mail envelope. Some of the most important ones are signature for the individual and filling out information in regard to the individual's driver's license or social security number that will need to be correlated with your voter file. Lastly, I'll touch on changes to anticipate or keep an eye on. As Erica had mentioned previously, polling location closures and consolidation of polling locations on Election Day are going to be a big problem this year, and they have been already for states that have had primary elections and municipal elections during COVID. And a big part of this is difficulty in finding poll workers to cover all of the locations that have been previously covered in previous elections. A large part of this is because our current poll workers are oftentimes quite a bit older than the general population. In the 2018 election, the average age of a poll worker is 61 years old. and many folks are falling into an age cohort that is directly impacted by COVID in ways that younger and healthier folks will not be. Next, opportunities to use drop boxes, and this one is moving in a good direction. We're seeing that many more jurisdictions are providing drop boxes as an opportunity for individuals to return absentee and vote by mail ballots. A lot of concern about drop boxes has been elevated as folks have had concerns about the functioning of the post office recently. Prepaid postage, especially with folks considering taking one task off of voters by having a jurisdiction cover prepaid postage makes it a bit easier, as then only folks have to fill out their ballot and return it without seeking out postage. We're hoping to continue making some changes to witness requirements, mail deadlines, and then lastly, one other thing we've been fighting for is expanded hours for early voting, as people are seeking out the ability to vote in person, but are concerned about long lines and things like that occurring on election day. For voting safely in person, be sure to wear a mask, adhere to social distancing guidelines, and I know that many folks will be bringing their own hand sanitizer in case it's not being offered at the polling location, but I assume that many polling locations will have that available. Lastly, to cover some resources that can help answer any and all of your questions. These are just some that are available, but some of my favorites. At aclu.org/voter, we're giving information on absentee voting and voting by mail this election. In addition, we're going to be adding additional information to help answer some of the most common questions that individuals have about casting a ballot. Vote.org is fantastic. It will help answer a lot of the front end questions of am I registered to vote? How do I register to vote? And then gives some information on different ways in which to cast a ballot as well. NewAmericanVoters2020.org. Obviously, I was just looking, they had some great information on casting a ballot by mail and excuse requirements. And then lastly, I'd spoken a little bit about this earlier, but the election protection hotline, if there are any questions or difficulties that individuals have when casting a ballot, the election protection hotline is there to help answer any of those questions and then help respond, because there is this is a connection for nonprofit attorneys working throughout the country that can also help solve any issues that come up through litigation. So one example of this is if you show up to your polling location, all of the machines are down. If you reach out to the election protection hotline, if the polls didn't open on time, there's a possibility that they can bring litigation in and ensure that the polls at that location then stay open later that night. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Nancy.
Thank you, Bobby, and just the whole team at the ACLU for just the incredible work that you do on behalf of all of us and have been doing for many years, as you shared. So at this time, I'd like to go into our Q&A portion of the presentation. We have some questions here, and if you have a question as well, please be sure to put it in the question box. But the first question here is for Erika. So is there anything that can be done to lift up grievances to all of the voter suppression efforts in Wisconsin? You're dealing with a lot. So this is a good question. Erika, do you have anything an answer for this?
Sure. So yeah, like mentioned, it's a lot. So I think one thing that we're doing is we're always trying to find allies when it comes to reaching out to our, I'm sorry, to our, local politicians about certain changes that can be made. So, for example, I know that we were part of a letter to our Governor Evers to make sure that DMVs were more accessible to people, and it really makes a difference when people, reach out to their local politicians to let them know about the importance and how important we feel about having just more accessibility when it comes to voting and all the, suppressions that we do have. So that would be important. Something else that we obviously will always want to, get some help with is with our different programs that we're doing to make sure that more people stay engaged with these issues. So we do have a relational voter program where we, connect our communities with these issues that do arise. So we will be, starting campaigns related to making sure that, so for example, we'll start with our Fair Maps campaign to just make sure that we're being, correctly represented. At the same time, we just want to make sure that we're reaching out to a bigger base when it comes to, issues of voter suppression. So yes, our relational voter program, feel free to reach out to Voces de la Frontera. We're on Facebook, as well as our website is vdls.org.
Great. Thank you, Erika. The next question is for Bobby. In the first slide, the purple or magenta states, this is a clarification question. Do you have to prove that you're a high-risk person to get mailed a ballot? Or is it just like that there's a drop-down option that COVID is the reason? Or do you have to prove that that you're particularly high risk? So the question is just to clarify. And then does it vary by state?
So in all of those purple states, it's my understanding that due to COVID, essentially anyone can list COVID as a reason that they would like to cast an absentee ballot. So due to concerns over COVID, not necessarily being high risk, but being concerned about contracting COVID or, having concerns about spread of COVID are reason enough in those purple states so that you can request and cast an absentee ballot. Some of the red states are considering doing, specific, guidelines for individuals who are high risk, but are not opening it up to everyone.
Got it. And a quick follow-up here for Bobby. Do you anticipate further attacks on the post office?
Given this president's rhetoric, it is certainly not beyond reason that there would be attacks on the post office, at least from, a sense of questioning the post office's capabilities of, carrying out their duties and ensuring that individuals who request and cast an absentee ballot have their ballot delivered on time. However, I do think that most of the attacks that are likely to occur will be driving a narrative of fraud about the ability of folks to request and cast an absentee ballot, and I think that is probably what we're most likely to see is individuals call into question the validity of the election due to so many people casting a ballot by mail. However, what we've seen from previous elections and what we've seen from recent elections, where many folks have cast their ballot by mail, that it is safe, secure, and trusted, and that there is absolutely no backing to those questions and calls to question the validity of the election.
Yeah, thank you for that. Something we'll continue to watch closely. The next question here for Erika. can you share more about your poll worker recruitment strategies and the witness voter program, which you mentioned, which I think, to clarify, that's in most states you need to have a witness that's also a voter sign your absentee envelope. So just to clarify, that's what the witness is. So if you could just talk a little bit more about those strategies, I think folks are interested to hear how you're implementing some of those things. And obviously, recruiting poll workers is going to be really critical for this election. And I think that, it's really interesting, Bobby, when you mentioned that, the average age is like 61. I think that it's very obvious why there's going to be an even bigger poll worker shortage. It looks like that there's always a shortage, but this year even more. So the questions for Erika, if you can share a little bit more about those topics.
Sure. So I guess the first thing that we're doing is we obviously in a bilingual setting, we're just making sure to let our Voces base know who can be poll workers. So it's important to be, you can be a poll worker living within the county where you'll be voting. You have to be older than 18 as well, and you have to be a citizen. So once we start talking about the importance of poll workers, first we want to make sure that our base, is able to meet these requirements, and that way they can also tell their family members. So we've been making campaigns via calls to our members, and after that we had 56 people that we ID'd and that confirmed that they would be ready to go and be poll workers for the upcoming elections. Some of them were even able to be new poll workers for the August 11th election, so that was pretty exciting to see. And so, we've also been helping them with the process. The information to become a poll worker, for example, here in the Milwaukee City is through the website, and it's not bilingual, so we've been helping people, guide them through that process of, submitting their information. And we've also have a base here in Voces de la Frontera, which is our youth base. They're called Youth Empowered in the Struggle. So that encompasses people that are, between middle school, high school, as well as university. And we have also been, touching base with the university students that are part of our YES program to make sure that they also engage and, become poll workers. So we want to also, like mentioned before, have, healthier, younger people and people that are new to being poll workers, and that we have been able to see in the August 11th election, more people being poll workers that haven't done that before. And when it comes to our witness voter campaign, we have throughout the state of Wisconsin, we have various chapters of Voces de la Frontera. As of now, we have 5 in different cities. We have civic engagement committees that are connected to these specific 5 cities. We're also branching out to other areas as well. What we're doing within these committees is getting a base of volunteers that want to do this work. And it's been quite exciting because we are reaching out to people that haven't been part of Voces de la Frontera in the past or are recently becoming more engaged with our voting efforts. And, it's been kind of exciting being able to work with people statewide on not only being witnesses, but also helping people with their ballots, helping people also do the online process of requesting their absentee ballots, specifically because once you, here in the state of Wisconsin, once you ask for an absentee ballot, you would need to show a form of ID of a copy. So many times that's an impediment to people if they're not able to, have a printer or have specific technology where they can, easily upload this information. So we've been, that's been our campaign, our voter campaign when it comes to the absentee ballots.
That's great and really creative. And I think that, it's obvious that the primaries helped to identify, where a lot of these weak spots are. If anybody's listening, that hasn't run a primary campaign and will be doing something in the fall, I think that these are important considerations. A few quick follow-ups for Erika, and then Bobby chime in here as well. So a quick follow-up here. How can voters track their absentee ballot?
Perfect. So here in the state of Wisconsin, we've been using the Wisconsin Election Commission site, which is the myvote.wi.gov. the site, there's a section called My Voter Info, and here people can not only track their absentee ballot, but they can also, check to see if their registration is updated, make any changes if need be when it comes to their name or their address. And it kind of guides you by dates to see when you got your absentee ballot confirmed. The request for your absentee ballot was confirmed when they when they sent it out via mail, and when you should have received it, and also when they received it and that it was confirmed that your ballot was confirmed and counted. So we're helping people with this process as well. Was there a follow-up question? Sorry.
Yeah, and another one. So I think that's specific for Wisconsin. And Bobby, would you say that generally the website where you request your ballot is usually where you can track it?
Yes. So for many states that use barcode scans that are part of absentee ballot envelopes, you'll be able to track the ballot from beginning to end, and then the election administrators will update as your ballot has been processed. Unfortunately, not every state uses a process like Wisconsin, especially those that have not conducted a large part of their elections by mail previously. For those, unfortunately, the only way currently for those states is to call the election administrator's office and confirm that, call or email your election administrator's office and confirm that it had been received.
Got it. That's helpful. Here's a really critical question. For how long after the polls have closed will absentee ballots be counted? So I'll turn this one over to Bobby, and I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in.
So that answer really depends on the state. Some states need ballots to be returned by the time that polls close on election day. Some require a postmark that be made on the ballot in order for the ballot to be counted, as long as it's returned within a certain period of time after election day. Here in Virginia, there's actually even a small gap period where if a ballot shows up without a postmark, it can still be counted up until the Friday at noon following the election. So this is going to differ a little bit from state to state, but in general, some states require that absentee ballots be returned and at the election administrator's office or polling location before the closing of polls on election day. And then in addition to that, many states have postmark dates where ballots will even be counted after election day if they are postmarked the day of the election or the day before the election.
Great, and I think that's something that will maybe take a little longer this year to get election results than what folks are anticipating, and hopefully not much longer. But we'll keep our eye on that. The next question is for NPNA. I'll turn this one over to Diego, my colleague. COVID has slowed things down at USCIS, which we've seen a lot in the news. Can you share how many people are in the backlog and how many will not be able to vote by November because they won't have completed their citizenship?
Yeah, absolutely. So USCIS under the Trump administration has pursued a series of policies and practices that make citizenship less accessible and make naturalization a more lengthy and complicated process. This has resulted in a backlog of over 700,000 citizenship applications, according to the latest USCIS data. Earlier this year, we estimated that dating back from 2014, there would be 5.3 million newly naturalized citizens who will be able to register and vote this year. The majority of those 3.1 million will have naturalized since the election of Donald Trump to president in 2016. we're concerned that around 300,000 people in the backlog who are waiting for their interview will not be able to complete this process, meaning that the mismanagement of USCIS and its inability or unwillingness to adapt to the coronavirus pandemic will effectively disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of soon-to-be citizens, and that our original estimates of 5.3 million newly naturalized citizens will be slightly less, closer to 5 million newly naturalized citizens since 2014 who are going to be able to vote this year. So it's not good news, but it could have been worse, and we're holding the line. USCIS a few months ago began to claim that it needed to furlough around 70% of its workers if Congress didn't provide emergency funding. And it was set to begin those furloughs last week, which would have effectively halted the immigration system and adjudication of naturalization and so many other applications. But NPNA members and advocacy partners worked with congressional leaders to prevent the furloughing of USCIS workers, and USCIS agreed to this. But it claimed that the backlogs will continue, and that it only has funding to operate through the fiscal year. That would take us through the end of October and into November, right around the time of the presidential elections. So the situation is one where we, NPNA and others, are continuing to call for congressional funding for USCIS, but that happened with conditions like that the agency reduce the backlogs, reduce the processing delays, and reverse so many of the policies and practices that it's moved forward with over the last few years, which makes citizenship less accessible, including the proposed fee increases, which are set to take effect on October 2nd, and also expanding access to fee waivers and so many other administrative policies that would hold USCIS accountable. So when Senate comes back, we're going to be continuing that congressional advocacy so that USCIS is held accountable by Congress, and that so many people who are currently being held back from citizenship and being held back from the fundamental right to vote are able to get the citizenship which they're eligible for and exercise the right to the ballot.
Thank you, Diego. We have one last question here, and I'll actually do a quick follow-up for you, Diego. Where can people get more information, some of the information, for example, that Bobby shared around the maps and all of that, but in Spanish? So I'll turn that over to Diego, and then Bobby, let us know if you have anything to add.
Yes, absolutely. Please visit newamericanvoters2020.org. We have a map in English and Spanish where, depending on what state you are, it will tell you whether there is no excuse required to vote by mail, whether there is an excuse, and whether fears related to the coronavirus pandemic is a sufficient excuse for voting by mail. In addition to that, we also can connect you on that map, on that website, with NPNA member organization or affiliate, so that they could help you with that process if you're not so strong with the English language, or for any other reason.
Great. Anything else to add on resources in other languages, Bobby, or anything like that at the ACLU's website?
No, but I will flag that through 866 Our Vote, I think on the resources page there, I provided some information for multiple languages that if folks have questions, they can call 866 Our Vote and be directed in the right fashion in order to have assistance in multiple different languages. And then I will also plug a project that I used to work on, the Voting Information Project, that I believe is now run through Democracy Works, but on election day, it takes over the Google Doodle, and as individuals are looking up their polling location or general election information. That tool as well, I believe, is available in 12 different languages.
Great, thanks so much. So that concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much for everybody that joined, and this, in essence, concludes the first part of our webinar series. Next week, we're actually going to be launching an important conversation, an important series with We Are All America, and really honing in on the role of refugees and former refugees that have now naturalized, and really specifically on what are some ways to mobilize that community to get to the polls this year. So that kicks off next week, Wednesday, September 9th. So we'll be sending out some information on that, and then those will go through October. So more information there, and you're certainly welcome to come to that, and we'll be sending out the lineup of topics as soon as we have it. So thank you all for joining, and we'll be sending the materials after this presentation. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.